So you want to read War and Peace and you're daunted by its size, or you started it and you just can't get into it? Well, if that's you, then watch this video because I've got a few tips that are going to help you get through this incredible work of classic literature. What's up, readers? My name is Adam, aka a dude who reads, and War and Peace is one of my favorite novels of all time, and I've talked about that a lot on this channel. And without fail, every single time I bring up how much I love War and Peace, I have someone who will reach out to me either in the comments or offline anytime I'm talking about this novel and say, I've heard so many great things about War and Peace, or I've heard something about War and Peace, but every time I pick it up, I just can't seem to get into it. I want to enjoy it, but I just don't think it's for me. And I think that's a shame because even though this book is a massive investment of time and frankly a little bit of energy, the rewards at the end of it are simply phenomenal. And that's why to this day, I still put this up there in my favorite books of all time. And the more time goes by, the closer I think it might be my absolute favorite book of all time. So without too much more preamble, what I want to do is I want to give you a few tips about how you could get into War and Peace so that hopefully you get as much out of this book as I did. And even if it doesn't end up becoming one of your favorites, at the very least, you get the bragging rights of being able to say you finished one of the longest novels ever written. And hey, isn't that kind of cool? The first thing you're going to want to do if you are reading War and Peace, and especially if you're reading Russian literature for one of the first times, is you're going to want to get a handle on how Russian names work. Now, this seems like an odd statement, but the reality is if you are a native English speaker and you've spent most of your life reading primarily in English and interacting mostly with English-speaking people, the way Russian names work can be a little bit confusing, and especially especially in a novel like War and Peace, where the number of characters is so huge and there are so many different ways that you call different characters because of nicknames and diminutives and all this stuff. So you really need to get a basic grasp on how the naming works. And it's really not that complicated. So the first thing you need to understand about Russian names is that there are three names for each person: a given name or first name, a patronym, which is often used as the middle name, and then a surname or a last name or family name. And so middle name, first name, middle name, last name, that's pretty standard, especially amongst English speakers. What's different about Russian names is that where those names come from is often where the confusion comes from, because the middle names and even the family names are often derived from a family member's first name. And so as a result, you have a lot of names, whether they be first names, middle names, or last names, that all start to look very similar to each other. But if you can tell the difference between a first name, a middle name, and a last name, or a given name, a patronym, and a surname, then it all becomes a little bit easier. So the first thing you need to understand is the patronym essentially is your father's name with a suffix added to it. So if your father's name was Fyodor, your patronym would be Fyodorovich if you're male, or Fyodorovna if you are female. And by the way, please forgive my pronunciation. I am by no means an expert in Russian. I know just enough to get through translations of Russian literature, and that's what I'm trying to pass on to you here. Similarly, for last names, oftentimes last names will be based on a first name. So again, if I use Fyodor, a common Russian last name would be Fyodorov, and if you were a female, it would be Fyodorova. Right? So you have the other thing that is maybe a little bit confusing to native English speakers is that for Russian names, you have a male version of the name and a female version of the name. So three names: a first name, a patronym, and a last name. And for both the patronym and the last name, oftentimes you have male and female versions of that. If you keep that in mind, then the entire ability to recognize characters becomes a little bit easier, especially if you start to understand their family trees, because just in a character's name, you get an indication of who their father was, and that actually helps deconstruct a little bit the complex web of relationships that you're going to have in a novel like War and Peace, where I don't remember what the exact number of characters present in this novel is, but at the front of the book there is a sort of a roll call of everyone in the novel, and it spans several pages. So there are probably dozens of characters in this book, so it helps to understand their names. The other thing that you're just going to need to get used to is that depending on the relationship between characters, and between people in Russian society, what you call someone is going to be a little bit different. So if you have a formal relationship with someone or an arm's length relationship with someone, they will use your given name and your patronym. But if you have a closer relationship with them because they're family members or they're a really close friend, then you would use a nickname or a diminutive. And so those are just things you kind of need to get used to, because some of these things, there is no way to really know unless you are really, familiar with them. So someone like Natasha is actually Natalia, and there's other forms of short forms for all of these names. And until you kind of get a feel for them, you can kind of get confused with all these different forms of names. But starting with given name, patronym, and then last name, and understanding the structure of those, that'll already get you a good way of the way there to understanding who these characters are. The second thing that's really helpful if you are reading War and Peace is to have a general understanding of the time period during which it's taking place. So War and Peace takes place over the course of about 8 years, starting in 1805 and going till 1813. So if you know your European history a little bit, you know that that is right around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And it is in that period of 1805 to 1813, you have Napoleon's invasion of Russia. So it should be no surprise why this book is called War and Peace. It deals very, very closely with the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. And knowing a little bit about that period of history is going to help you to understand the novel. Now, I'm not saying you need to go out and become a scholar or an expert on any of these things. No, by no means. But doing something as simple as just, doing a quick read of the Wikipedia page about the Napoleonic Wars, and then maybe about sort of Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia or the Battle of Borodino. If you just look up those things and get passingly familiar with this stuff, it will go a long way towards helping you understand the time period, and maybe even doing just a quick, another quick search about sort of the position of the Russian aristocracy versus the working class or the peasant class at that time, just to have a feel for the political feeling at that moment. Again, I'm not asking you to go out and read volumes and volumes of history on this stuff, but just doing a quick Wikipedia search for a few topics, knowing that stuff going into this novel will make a lot of the things in here make a lot more sense. And no, it's not cheating. It just gives you a little bit of the context that anyone who was reading this book when it was first published in, I believe it was in the 1860s, would already have had that knowledge, because it is just sort of their common knowledge. It's kind of like you knowing about what happened in World War II. It's the same sort of idea for the people who would have been reading this book. It would actually even have been more recent than World War II. I forget how far along in history we are. But regardless, having that understanding is going to be really important for you. The next thing that's going to be really helpful for you when you are reading War and Peace is to find a translation that speaks to you. So War and Peace, being the classic that it is and having the reputation that it does, obviously has been translated probably a dozen times by different translators. There's a few translations that tend to get brought up very often. The translation that I like, because it is the one that I first read after having looked at a few different ones, is the Maud translation that was published by Oxford World Classics, that was then revised by Amy Mandelker. I like this translation for a couple of reasons. One, I've read a few pages out of a bunch of different translations, and I like the way the prose in this one flows. I kind of just enjoy the way that it feels. The second reason, and I wouldn't put a ton of stock into this, but it's sort of a nice to have anyway, is apparently Tolstoy himself signed off on the original Maud translation, saying that this was, close to what he had intended. So that's always good for me to know that, the author is, gave his stamp of approval to the work. And the third reason that I like this specific translation, and I only learned recently that it is not all of the Maud translations, but specifically the Oxford World Classic one, preserves the French in the text. So there's a decent amount of this book which is written in French, which don't let that dissuade you, because the entire book was originally written in Russian and you're reading a translation anyway. Whether you're reading translated Russian or translated French, it shouldn't really change anything for you. For me, particularly because I can read French, I wanted to read as much of the original book as I could. And so I wanted the one that preserves the French, and it just footnotes the translations of the French in the footnotes, because it's as close as I will ever get to reading War and Peace in its original, at least until I learn to read Russian, which is not going to happen anytime soon. So that is why I like this particular translation, this particular edition. That being said, that doesn't mean you necessarily need to run out and get this one. I've also heard good things about the Anthony Briggs translation, which is published by Penguin Classics, and there are a bunch of other ones out there. Again, my best tip to you is read a few pages of each. You can usually get a free preview of the first few pages of a book on Amazon when you're shopping. So just flip through a few of the pages see which ones of them connect with you the most, see which version of the prose you like the best, and adopt that one and just go with it. If you really enjoy the book, then maybe you can come back and read a different translation. You can compare them, but don't worry about that just yet. No one's going to ask you to read a 1,400 page book twice unless you absolutely want to. At this point, it's all about finding the translation that works best for you. The next tip I have for you is to pick a reading pace for War and Peace that works for you. Now, unlike reading most other novels, because War and Peace is so long and it is so dense and it follows so many characters over such a long period of time, people have a hard time binging this book. So whereas most people have probably read a book in a matter of days or weeks or maybe a month, very few people rush through War and Peace. And so there's different methods that you can use to kind of parse your way through the book. One of them is to take the chapter a day approach to War and Peace. So War and Peace is split into 4 books or 4 volumes, and within each of those volumes you have parts and you have chapters. In total, I believe there are 360 chapters in all of War and Peace, which means that if you read a single chapter a day of War and Peace, it will take you a year to read through the entire book. Now, that might seem like a really long time, but remember that if you do the math on this, every chapter in War and Peace is only about 3 to 4 pages long, which means that you're only probably reading, if you read at an average reading speed, for 5 to 10 minutes a day. I personally started doing the chapter a day approach to reading War and Peace, and it took me a little while to get into the book. And then once I really kind of got immersed into the story and really connected with the characters, I kind of threw my entire reading plan out the window, and I just sort of consumed the book as it drew me in, which is a lot closer to how I read other books. And so even though I started with a chapter a day, by the time I finished the book, I was probably reading closer to 30 to 40 pages a day, which is more like 10 to 12 chapters a day. So a chapter a day is one way you can approach this. Another way to do it would be just to pick a certain number of pages per day to kind of set yourself a goal to slowly work your way through it. Or lastly, just kind of let the book draw you in whichever way you feel. If you are going to take this last approach, though, I do want to caution you, because one of the things that happens a lot when people first start reading War and Peace is they start the book and they kind of disconnect from it. Because at the beginning of War and Peace, you're being introduced to so many different characters, and there is so much there's so much setup that is being done for so much variation in terms of the people that you're going to be following, that it is really hard to get into the story. So a lot of people start reading War and Peace and then give up after a little while. So if you are going to just kind of go with a pace where, whatever mood takes you, I do suggest that you give yourself sort of a hard limit and say, at the very least, I'm going to commit to reading the first 200, 250 pages. That might seem like a lot, but remember, this book is about 1,400 pages long, so 2 to 300 pages, really you're only committing to reading the first 10 to 20% of the book. And I can almost guarantee you that if you do make it that far, you will start to connect with these characters, and it will be so worth it, and you will really start to feel like you're being drawn in by the story. The other thing you're going to want to do when you are reading War and Peace is you are going to want to really use the footnotes and the endnotes of whatever edition that you have picked up. One of the reasons I like this Oxford World's Classic edition is because the footnotes are absolutely fantastic, and they give me a bunch of the context that I otherwise would not have. So it just so happened that before reading War and Peace, I had not long before that finished reading a biography of Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, which was a decent biography. I wouldn't say it was great by any stretch of the definition, but it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. But what it did do was it gave me a lot of context about the time period that I was reading, and definitely a lot more context than you would get if you were just doing sort of a cursory Wikipedia search. And yet, I've said the only thing you really need to do is get a little bit of background, and you'll figure out the rest as you go. One of the ways that you're going to figure out the rest is by reading those footnotes and endnotes, because the editors of these editions do a fantastic job of bringing the modern reader up to speed about any kind of passing reference that would have made sense to a 19th century Russian who was reading this when it was first published, as opposed to a 21st century reader who is reading this 200 years removed from when it was originally published. So use those endnotes, use those footnotes, don't skip over them. I know a lot of readers, especially casual readers, will skip the footnotes and will skip the endnotes. I do not recommend you do that, because understanding the context will help you get much more out of the story and help you connect with those characters all that much more, because you'll understand the realities that they are living in. Yet another thing that you can do to help you get the most out of this book And this is something I tend to do with all of my books, but with War and Peace, I think it's even more important, is you're going to want to take notes, whether you are taking them in the margin as Marginalia or whether you're keeping a separate notebook. I really think that is super important with War and Peace. You can see this is my copy here, and I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera, but you can see there is markings, underlines, notes in the margin. This is essentially what all of my books look like, so there's nothing really special about that. I've talked in other videos about why I like to mark up my books. I think it allows me to engage more deeply with the story. I feel like it allows me to connect with the characters better. It makes me feel like I'm having a conversation with the author, even if it's happening across a couple of centuries. And so I'm a big fan of Marginalia. But with War and Peace, I feel like it's even more important because the story is so vast. Taking notes while you're reading, it can actually help you ingrain some of the story points, because especially if you're reading this over a long period of time, sometimes you will encounter a character and then you will move on to another part of the story, and then you'll follow another character, and it will be several hundred pages before you get back to the previous character that we were originally talking about. And if you have not taken those notes and you haven't taken those margin notes, it becomes sometimes a little bit more difficult to remember where you last saw this character, which is why for War and Peace, I actually did something which I don't usually do, which is I actually kept a reading journal, which I did not title, but you can see the journal here, where essentially for every single chapter, I took some notes. Essentially, what I did was I looked at what happened in that chapter, which characters were introduced in the chapter, some notes about what I thought about the chapter, what I thought might happen next. And it was just, again, another way for me to more easily engage with the work. But the other benefit that this had, especially towards the beginning of reading the book, when I was doing the chapter a day approach to reading, is if there was a character that I had already encountered, but it had been a few weeks before I had seen them, I could just flip back through my notes and say, okay, this is the last place I saw that character, and it put me back into where I was. I know this seems like a lot of effort just to read a book, but this is how great I think this book is. I feel like if you're going to read it, there's no point doing it quickly. There's no point doing it just to get it over with. You might as well really invest in it, get as much out of the story as you can, because there's a reason why War and Peace is one of the all-time greats. So I think it is worth taking a little bit of time and creating a notebook like this. By the way, in case you're wondering, this is not what my usual writing looks like. While I was creating these notes, I also decided that I was going to practice my cursive handwriting, but this is not what I usually write like. So if you're wondering why there's this script here, it was just me trying to kill two birds with one stone. Moving on. Coming towards the end now, here's a tip that I think is useful not just for reading War and Peace, but really for reading any book that's a little bit more difficult. If there's a specific thing that is tripping you up that you don't understand, or you feel like you're missing a piece of the history, don't get bogged down in it. Don't stop yourself. Don't stop the reading to go Google something or look something up. Just plow through it. Come back to it later if you really need to. A lot of the stuff that you don't understand is either going to be unimportant to the overall story, or it is something that you'll figure out as you go along, or if it really is that important, you can figure it out later. But don't interrupt your flow of reading and of enjoyment to look up every single little detail or fact or piece of history that you don't understand, just to kind of have a complete picture of what the world was like at that moment in time. Just let the story flow. Things will become clear. Worst case scenario, you can always come back later and look that stuff up. I guarantee you there is not enough in this book that's going to be so incredibly mind-boggling to you that you will not be able to grasp the overall story, because the overall story is a masterpiece and you do not need a PhD to appreciate it. And my last real tip here is when you're reading War and Peace, the thing that I really suggest that you do is get invested with the characters, because that's the thing that's going to pull you through this sort of immense tome doorstopper of a book, right? Because it's not like there is a whole bunch of suspense or drama or plot-driven action that is really going to be the thing that pulls you through. After all, in a lot of ways, War and Peace is a historical novel, and so you probably know how it ends, right? If you know anything about European history, you know that Napoleon's not going to win the invasion in Russia. Hopefully I did not spoil anything for anyone, but what will really pull you through this book is getting invested with the characters and getting to know them, treating them like friends, right? So you will develop these relationships, these strong feelings for the Andres and the Pierres and the Natashas, and you will just come to think of them as people in your social circle, which means that when anything good happens to them, you're going to be happy for them. When something bad happens to them, you are going to be sad. When they do stupid things, which they do on a regular basis, you will become frustrated with them. At many points during this book, I got so frustrated with some of the characters that I literally wanted to growl and scream at the book, which is not something that I typically do, but that is how real and how well fleshed out these characters are. And I really think that is one of the things that makes War and Peace such a phenomenal piece of writing. It is an epic story spread across 8 years with dozens and dozens of characters, and yet the characters that are in it are so well developed, so truly real, that you have a good feel for who they are. You watch them as they grow, you watch them as they change, you watch them as they evolve. So really invest yourself in the characters, and that's going to really be the thing that I feel like pulls you through this book. And call this last one a bonus tip. My last bonus tip for reading War and Peace is really, and this is going to, throw a monkey wrench into everything else that I just said, but do whatever works for you. At the end of the day, this is a book, and most of us here are reading books for our own enjoyment because we want to grow from them and because we want to have fun with them. So just kind of be light with it. Take it easy. Take this for what it is, which is a really great work of art, and works of art are meant to be enjoyed, right? So don't take it so seriously. Don't treat it like work. Have fun with it. Go at whatever pace works for you. Do whatever works for you. If you want to read chapter summaries online, because that is going to help you get through certain parts. If there's parts of the novel that you want to completely skip over because they're a little bit drier, there's specifically in book 4, there's entire chapters which are more like essays and they are part of the story. If you want to skip those, no one is going to come to your house and wag their finger at you for skipping a bunch of pages. Do whatever feels good to you, whatever it takes to get through something that should ultimately be an enjoyable experience that you should come out on the other side of and say, I feel really good about this. And I think it will be worth it in the end, because like I said, it was a big investment of time and energy for me to read War and Peace, but I definitely have zero regrets, and if nothing else, it is something that I plan on reading, if not once, multiple times more in the future, because that is how much I enjoyed this particular work, and I hope you do as well. And on that note, that's where I'm going to end this video. I hope you found something in here that was helpful to you, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you drop a like on the video and you subscribe to the channel for more content like this and other reading related material. And before I start sounding like an infomercial, I'm going to sign off. Have a great day. Take it easy, guys. Cheers.